Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu agreeing to form a national unity government with members of the opposition to lead his country in its war with Hamas. At least 1,200 Israelis have been killed, thousands more injured since Israel began airstrikes on Gaza. At least 1,000 people have been killed there, according to reports. For more on this conflict, how it evolves from here, we turn to Dan Senor, former foreign policy advisor in the George W. Bush administration and co-author of the bestseller Startup Nation and the forthcoming book, The Genius of Israel. Dan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, good to be with you. Wish it were under better circumstances, but we are where we are.
Dan, let me start here with Israeli policy, where there has been a big shift. For a long time, Dan, and you've talked about this, that Israel's policy was to contain Hamas, and now it has shifted to destroying Hamas. I'm interested, Dan, though, in what that actually looks like tactically and strategically. And if Israel achieves its aims, Dan, who takes over from Hamas?
Yeah, these are all great questions. Israel for the last couple of decades has, as you said, just managed its existence, its coexistence, if you will, with Hamas. That is to say, there were military skirmishes every couple of years over the Israeli-Gaza border. Gaza would send rockets over into Israel. Israel would, fire back from the air. There were collateral damage on both sides. But it wasn't this sort of trench terrorist warfare that Israel had to defend against, terrorists going neighborhood to neighborhood, home to home, just like slaughtering Israelis in a way that is some mix of 9/11 and 1930s pre-Holocaust Germany. And so Israel has decided it cannot live with Hamas on its border. So the first priority is getting rid of Hamas out of a governing role in Gaza. Second is getting rid of all the military capabilities, at least all that they can find from inside Gaza. So Gaza can no longer be a launching pad for these wars against Israel. And then obviously figure out who's going to govern Gaza going forward. But it's not clear. What is clear is the status quo is unacceptable, and there's whatever follows Hamas will not be worse than Hamas. I think there's potential opportunities for governments in the Arab world who want some stability to play a role. I think there's going to be a lot of this to be figured out, but right now it's get rid of Hamas, get rid of the military capabilities, and there is no real plan right now for what will succeed it.
Dan, what was your sense of Iran's role in this attack? Of course, we've seen different reports about that. And what do you think the likelihood is that Israel attacks Iran and this conflict really broadens?
Well, there's no doubt Iran is involved in some way. In other words, Hamas is as strong as it is because it has been getting funding from Iran. It's been getting arms from Iran going back decades. They're openly supportive of one another. Gazan Palestinians are basically pawns in Iran's war against Israel. We can debate whether or not the Palestinians have a territorial grievance with Israel. Certainly not Hamas in Gaza, because Israel pulled out of Gaza in 2005. But Iran's grievance, what exactly is Iran's grievance? And so the real tragedy here is Gazan Palestinians are used, Hamas, by the Iranians. I think that right now it is probably in Israel's best interest to avoid a multi-front war. I'm not a tactical military operator, but the idea that Israel's got its hands full right now with beating back Hamas in Gaza is probably true. And the last thing Israel needs is a war with Iran. The question is what happens in the northern border. We've seen some action today on the northern border, but it doesn't look like full-scale war like we've seen on the southern border. And I think Iran is waiting to see if there's any threat against Iran before it activates Hezbollah in the north, which right now hasn't happened.
And Dan, you, of course, were co-author of the bestseller Startup Nation. I'm interested how you think this war is going to impact Israel's economy, the business community, and specifically, of course, the Israeli tech community.
Yeah, so Israel, this is not the first time that Israel's dealt with a major crisis. We wrote in our last book, in Startup Nation, how during the 1991 Gulf War, there were Scuds landing in Israel from Iraq. It shut down the whole country. It shut down the whole economy. And yet Intel, for instance, which had a major innovation center in Israel at the time, the facilities in Israel just kept functioning. The Israelis working nonstop. They still work 24 hours a day, even when they weren't supposed to be. Today, There are between 400 and 500 intels, if you will, in Israel, 400 to 500 major multinationals that have set up operations in Israel. And I just think with each crisis in Israel, what multinational companies that do business in Israel and rely on their most critical innovations on Israelis for have learned is that no matter what, Israelis are pretty good in crisis. And that actually is the focus of my next book, which is, you mentioned, The Genius of Israel, which the subtitle is The Surprising Resilience of a Divided Nation in a Turbulent World. When we wrote that book, we didn't anticipate, obviously, how much Israelis would have to call on that resilience. But what we point out in the book is that in these crises, the Israeli capacity to come together is extraordinary, and it's like nowhere else in the world. And in that sense, it's one of the healthiest societies in the world. And that's why I think all these multinationals, one of the reasons they do business in Israel and set up shop in Israel, and why all these VCs around the world are investing in Israel, is not because there's incredible brain power and entrepreneurialism, but this is a fundamentally healthy society that knows how to work together and come together in a crisis. And so I don't think you'll see any change in the global innovation economies, record level investing in Israel.
Dan, I want to get you out of here on this question, though. Having said that, Dan, what do you think the risk is here of any kind of brain drain in Tel Aviv? Meaning enough Israeli engineers, entrepreneurs, technologists think, you know what, post this war, post this conflict, too much, I'm moving to the U.S. or I'm moving to Europe.
So I'm pleased you're asking me these questions, because this is literally what, this is a subject I'm moved about. This is the subject of our next book, which it comes out in a couple of weeks. The brain drain is what we're watching is the opposite of the brain drain, which is Israelis get frustrated with Israeli life. It's expensive, it's noisy, it's contentious. This is before the war. It's noisy, it's contentious, it's politically divisive. I mean, domestically, you saw this big debate in Israel over the last 9 months over judicial reform, and so there is sometimes a desire for Israelis to live somewhere else. And then they live somewhere else and they realize they miss being part of Israel. They like that they had a part of national service, that they served in the military. They felt that they were contributing to the country. They want their children to be part of this national, patriotic, public service, communal-oriented country. And so even tech leaders who leave Israel, we write about in our book this magnet that keeps pulling them back, which is like the health of their communal lives, of their family lives, of their sense of being part of the national experiment, which is the state of Israel. And that sense of meaning that they derive from that, they really don't feel alone the way they feel when they live in Silicon Valley or London or Berlin, keeps bringing them back. And I would say, tragically, we are seeing that in real time right now. I'll give you an example. The reserves, Israel's put out word, they're calling on hundreds of thousands of reserves. I asked an Israeli official the other day, what's the percentage of turnout for the reserves? He said, actually, it's 150%. We called more reserves than we need because we didn't know, for whatever reason, there would be some drop-off. We've got now more people turning up than we know what to do with. Even people who weren't called up are showing up. And so I do think Israelis, particularly in the tech community, and you saw them in the middle of these judicial reform debates, getting very involved in the debate about the future of the country. And I think those are the same people that are turning out in massive numbers to fight in this war, to do their reserve duty, to volunteer in a civilian role. There's a real connection to country that they feel part of, that they just don't get that sense of meaning and purpose elsewhere in the world. And I think that's like a comparative advantage for Israel, because I think the tech leaders in Israel feel that in Israel, where they don't feel anywhere else in the world. And I would say many of their peers around the world who aren't from Israel don't feel that in the countries they live in.
Dan Senor, thank you so much for your time and this insight today, Dan. We really do appreciate it.
Thanks.